Right now, in China, engineers are doing something that sounds almost ridiculous. They're making fuel from air. They're freezing air to store electricity for an entire night. They're turning sunlight and water into chemicals that could one day fuel cargo ships. They're mass-producing the machines needed to make hydrogen, and inside a giant metal ring, they're trying to reproduce the reaction that powers the sun. At first, these look like completely separate experiments. They're not, because all of them point toward the same problem, a problem China has been trying to solve for decades. And to understand it, you have to look at one tiny stretch of ocean between Malaysia and Indonesia, the Strait of Malacca. China is one of the largest industrial economies on Earth. Its factories make everything from phones and cars to machinery, chemicals and steel. But that machine has a weakness: energy. China consumes enormous amounts of oil, and much of that oil comes from overseas, which means before it reaches a refinery, a factory, or a fuel tank inside China, it has to travel. And a huge share of those shipments pass through Malacca. Look at a map and you'll immediately see the problem. The Indian Ocean is enormous. Then, suddenly, the route narrows into a thin corridor between Malaysia and Indonesia. For an oil tanker heading toward East Asia, there aren't many convenient alternatives. That makes Malacca more than a shipping lane. It makes it a strategic vulnerability. Chinese leaders have worried about this for years. It's often called the Malacca Dilemma. China has built pipelines. It has expanded strategic petroleum reserves. It has invested in ports and alternative transport routes. Those things help, but they don't completely remove the underlying problem. If your economy depends on fuel that has to travel thousands of kilometers before you can use it, somebody can potentially interrupt that journey. So there is another way to attack the problem. Don't just protect the route, make the route matter less. And that's where this story gets interesting. Imagine making jet fuel without drilling for oil. No tanker arriving from the Persian Gulf. No crude oil crossing the Indian Ocean. Instead, your raw materials are carbon dioxide, water, and electricity. That's the idea behind synthetic fuel. The basic chemistry is surprisingly simple. First, you need carbon. That carbon can be captured from CO2. Then, you need hydrogen. Run electricity through water and you can separate the hydrogen from the oxygen. Combine that hydrogen with captured carbon under the right conditions, and you can produce synthetic hydrocarbons that can be processed into aviation fuel. In other words, you are taking molecules that already exist around you and rebuilding them into fuel. China is now trying to move this idea beyond the laboratory. A pilot facility in Shanghai is producing synthetic fuel at relatively small scale, with plans described in the project to move toward much larger commercial production. And that distinction matters, because making a few tons of synthetic fuel is chemistry. Making tens of thousands of tons economically is industry. That's the real battle. Synthetic aviation fuel remains expensive. It requires enormous amounts of clean electricity. Carbon capture costs money. Hydrogen costs money. And scaling an entirely new fuel supply chain is not easy. But China doesn't need this technology to replace every barrel of oil tomorrow for it to matter. It only has to become cheap enough and large enough to start replacing some of the oil that currently has to be imported. And aviation gives manufacturers a reason to try. Airlines are under growing pressure to reduce emissions, particularly in markets where sustainable aviation fuel requirements are being introduced. That creates something new energy technologies often don't have in their early years: buyers. So the first piece of the strategy is straightforward. If hydrocarbons normally have to come from underground and travel across oceans, try manufacturing some of them at home instead. But fuel is only half of the problem, because even if you build an energy system around solar and wind, you run into an annoying fact every single day: the sun goes down. Batteries are very good at storing electricity for a few hours. But an industrial economy doesn't only need power for a few hours. Factories run through the night. Cities run through the night. Hospitals definitely run through the night. And once renewable electricity becomes a large part of the grid, storing energy for longer periods becomes much more valuable. So engineers in China are testing a very different kind of battery, one whose storage material is free air. The process begins by taking ordinary atmospheric air and cooling it to roughly -194 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, it becomes a liquid. That liquid can then be stored inside insulated tanks. When electricity is needed later, the liquid is allowed to warm up. It turns back into gas, and as it does, it expands dramatically. That expansion can drive turbines and generate electricity. So during periods of excess renewable generation, electricity is effectively used to freeze air. Hours later, that frozen air becomes electricity again. It's an extraordinarily mechanical solution to a modern energy problem. No giant pile of lithium cells. No need to store electricity electrochemically. Mostly tanks, compressors, turbines, and very cold air. A large Chinese project, paired with solar generation, has been designed around this principle, providing hours of energy storage long after the sun has disappeared. Now, liquid air storage isn't going to replace every battery. Its efficiency, economics, and construction requirements are different. But that's not why it's interesting. It's interesting because an energy system doesn't necessarily need one perfect storage technology. It needs different tools for different jobs. Batteries can handle fast response. Pumped hydro can provide large-scale storage where geography allows it. And technologies like liquid air storage could potentially handle longer duration industrial demand. The bigger the toolbox gets, the less a grid has to rely on fossil fuel backup whenever renewable generation drops. But electricity can't solve everything. An electric grid can power a house. It can charge a car. It can run many factories. Moving a giant cargo ship across an ocean is harder. For that, engineers are looking again at one of the oldest industrial chemicals on Earth, ammonia. Hydrogen sounds like the perfect fuel. It's abundant. It can be produced from water. And when hydrogen itself is used in a fuel cell or burned, the carbon emissions at the point of use can be extremely low. There's just one major problem. Hydrogen is terrible luggage. It is incredibly light. To transport large amounts of it, you have to compress it, liquefy it at extremely low temperatures, or convert it into something easier to handle. And one possible solution is ammonia. Ammonia is basically a molecule containing nitrogen and hydrogen. More importantly, humans already know how to manufacture, store, and transport huge quantities of it. We've been doing it for generations because ammonia is essential to fertilizer. So, instead of shipping hydrogen directly, you can potentially bind hydrogen into ammonia. Now the energy becomes much easier to move. That's why ammonia is attracting attention not just from fertilizer producers, but from shipping companies and energy developers. Large cargo ships need enormous amounts of energy. Batteries are still extremely heavy for many long-distance routes. Ammonia offers another possibility. Produce hydrogen using renewable electricity. Combine it with nitrogen from the air, turn that into ammonia. Then, transport or use the ammonia as an energy carrier or fuel. It isn't automatically clean. How the hydrogen is produced matters enormously. And burning ammonia introduces engineering challenges, including controlling pollutants such as nitrogen oxides. But if those problems can be managed, something important changes. A cargo ship no longer has to depend exclusively on petroleum-derived fuel. China is already experimenting with new ways of producing ammonia using renewable hydrogen rather than natural gas. And that's when a pattern begins to emerge. Synthetic jet fuel needs clean hydrogen. Green ammonia needs clean hydrogen. Steel, chemicals, shipping, and energy storage could all potentially consume enormous quantities of clean hydrogen. Suddenly, hydrogen isn't just another fuel, it's becoming an industrial input, which raises a much bigger question. Who is going to make all of it? China's clean hydrogen output has been climbing rapidly. Large wind and solar projects are increasingly being paired with electrolyzers, machines that use electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. But the most important part of this story may not be the hydrogen itself. It may be the electrolyzer. Think about what happened with solar panels. At the beginning of the solar revolution, sunlight was available everywhere. The strategic advantage wasn't owning the sunlight. It was being able to manufacture the hardware cheaply enough to turn sunlight into electricity. Panels, inverters, supply chains, factories, scale. Hydrogen may develop in a similar way. Water exists almost everywhere. Renewable electricity can be produced in many countries. But if you want to turn that electricity and water into hydrogen, you need equipment. And China has become one of the world's dominant manufacturers of that equipment. That changes the geopolitical question. The old question was, who owns the oil? The new question may increasingly become, who builds the machine that replaces some of the oil? Imagine a country in Africa wants to build a green ammonia industry. It needs electrolyzers. A developer in South America wants to produce synthetic fuel, electrolyzers. A steel plant in Europe wants to replace fossil-derived hydrogen, again, electrolyzers. China doesn't need to own the water. It doesn't need to own the wind. It doesn't need to own the sun. If it builds a large share of the machines that convert those resources into usable energy, it can still sit at a crucial point in the supply chain. And Beijing clearly sees hydrogen as more than a science project. It has been incorporated into national energy planning. Large projects are being financed. State-owned energy companies are investing. Even companies built around petroleum are beginning to explore synthetic and lower carbon fuels. That may be the most important signal of all. When an oil company starts rebuilding part of its own infrastructure for a world using less conventional oil, the transition stops looking theoretical. But all of these technologies still have one constraint: electricity. Synthetic fuel needs huge amounts of it. Hydrogen needs huge amounts of it. Green ammonia needs huge amounts of it. Storage only works if there is electricity available to store in the first place. Solar is cheap but intermittent. Wind is powerful but variable. Hydro depends on geography. Nuclear fission can provide constant electricity but carries its own economic and political challenges. And then there is the technology that scientists have been chasing for more than half a century. The one that would make every earlier chapter in this story look completely different: fusion. Deep inside China's East reactor, scientists are trying to do something nature normally requires a star to accomplish: force atomic nuclei together. Fusion is the process that powers the sun. At extreme temperatures, light atomic nuclei can combine and release enormous amounts of energy. The promise is extraordinary: abundant fuel, no carbon dioxide from the fusion reaction itself, and potentially an energy source capable of operating continuously rather than depending on the weather. The problem? Doing fusion inside a star is easy. Gravity does most of the work. Doing it inside a machine on Earth is unbelievably difficult. The plasma has to reach temperatures hotter than the center of the sun. It has to remain stable. Powerful magnetic fields have to hold that plasma away from the walls of the reactor, and scientists have to extract more useful energy from the system than the entire process consumes. China's East Tokamak is one of several major machines around the world trying to solve pieces of that puzzle. It has repeatedly pushed plasma duration and confinement experiments further, generating headlines about China's so-called artificial sun. But fusion is not about to replace coal plants next year. It may take decades before commercial fusion becomes practical. Some approaches may fail entirely, and even successful fusion would still have serious engineering, materials, and cost challenges to solve. So why put it at the end of this story? Because if fusion eventually works economically, it attacks the bottleneck behind almost everything we've just discussed: electricity. Cheap, abundant, round-the-clock electricity would make producing hydrogen easier. That hydrogen could feed ammonia plants. It could feed synthetic fuel plants. Those fuels could serve sectors that are difficult to electrify directly. And storage technologies could help balance entire grids around the system. Fusion doesn't make those earlier inventions obsolete. It potentially makes them more powerful. And now, the individual pieces begin to look like something larger. For more than a century, energy power was heavily shaped by geography. Oil existed in specific places. Gas existed in specific places. Those resources had to travel through pipelines, ports, and narrow shipping lanes. That created leverage. An oil field was leverage. A pipeline was leverage. The Strait of Hormuz was leverage. Malacca was leverage. The map itself was part of the energy system. But renewable energy changes something fundamental. Sunlight isn't located beneath one desert. Wind isn't owned by one kingdom. Water isn't controlled by one petroleum cartel. The resources are far more distributed, which means the scarce thing may gradually shift from the resource to the machine. Solar panels, electrolyzers, storage systems, power electronics, synthetic fuel plants, advanced reactors. The countries capable of producing those machines cheaply and at enormous scale may gain a different kind of energy power. Not because everybody sends them barrels of oil, but because everybody buys their infrastructure. And this is where China's strategy starts to make more sense. Synthetic fuel alone won't eliminate China's dependence on imported oil. Neither will ammonia, neither will hydrogen. Liquid air storage certainly won't. Fusion may not arrive commercially for decades, but that's almost beside the point. China isn't betting on one miracle. It's building multiple pathways at the same time. If synthetic fuel becomes economical, China wants the factories. If hydrogen becomes enormous, China wants the electrolyzers. If long-duration storage becomes essential, it wants that infrastructure too. If fusion works, it wants to be among the countries that know how to build it. That is a very different strategy from simply finding another oil field. It's a strategy built around making energy rather than finding energy. And if even part of it succeeds, the consequences go far beyond China. Because the 20th century energy superpower was the country sitting on top of the resource, the 21st century energy superpower may be the country that builds the machine. And that leaves one uncomfortable question. If oil stops being the only reliable way to power planes, ships, factories, and entire economies, who loses the most? Not who wins, who loses? Because somewhere in that answer may be the country least prepared for the next energy system. Let me know who you think it is in the comments. And if you want to see what happens when this same manufacturing strategy moves from energy into AI, chips, and robotics, subscribe, because that's where this story gets even bigger.